virtual gavel being banned. The Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with remote committee proceedings of HRES 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum and will now recognize myself for opening remarks. First, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today on this hearing focused on strengthening U.S. ties with Southeast Asia. Home to more than 662 million people and with a combined GDP of 3.2 trillion, the economic promise and strategic importance of Southeast Asia are hard to overstate. I commend the Biden administration for its continued prioritization of the region and the high-level visits from officials since the administration came into office just 9 months ago. And today, with this hearing, I want to make sure there are no doubts about the U.S. government's and Congress's continued commitment to our Southeast Asian friends. The region's economic vibrancy, strategic location at the center of the world's maritime commerce, and demographic diversity are vitally all make Southeast Asia a place of critical importance for the United States. I look forward to discussing existing areas of cooperation and where we can expand the U.S. Southeast Asia partnership. As we hear from many of our allies and partners in Southeast Asia, what makes the region tick is the global commerce that courses through it. But many in the Southeast Asia region face challenges in maintaining economic independence, and as close friends and partners, we must continue to develop support for Southeast Asian nations in developing diverse sources of investment and export markets so that they can stand up to any economic coercion. I was one of 28 House Democrats to vote for Trade Promotion Authority in 2015 and supported and continue to support and hold out hope one day for U.S. participation in the TPP, or what is now called Cptpp. The United States should continue to lead in the region and think creatively on how to further integrate economically with Southeast Asia. This would include expanded digital infrastructure and connectivity across the region and setting the foundations for digital trade agreements that would harness Southeast Asia's immense potential. As a region dominated by the world's largest ocean, ensuring waterways remain free and open is a critical matter. Some countries seek to undermine maritime sovereignty through bullying and intimidation and by using gray zone tactics that intentionally blur the line between military and commercial naval activity. To be clear, there have long been maritime territorial disputes in the South China Sea, but the best way and safest way to resolve those disputes is by ensuring all countries abide by international laws and norms aimed at resolving them. We must continue to reinforce those norms with our allies and partners. The United States has worked closely with regional actors to spotlight these challenges, and I particularly commend the Filipino Coast Guard for publishing photos earlier this year that clearly showed what the PRC has been up to near Woodson Reef. Our subcommittee also did a joint hearing with the House Armed Services Committee, Sea Power Subcommittee, on this important issue in April. And I will continue to work with our regional partners to defend the security in this vital region. The importance of Southeast Asia extends beyond the traditional security challenges and promise of mutual economic prosperity that have been pillars of the U.S. relationship in the region. There are opportunities for broader cooperation and partnerships between the United States and Southeast Asian countries to address some of the most pressing threats today, including combating climate change, promoting global health security, and increasing supply chain resiliency. And President Biden's team has clearly seen this as well, and as evidenced by the concrete deliverables from high-level engagements. Obviously, the partnership between our countries is not without challenges. We do not always see eye to eye on every issue, but what unites us, including our shared commitment to promoting a free, open, inclusive, and prosperous Indo-Pacific, is far greater than what separates us. Just last week, the Senate confirmed Daniel Kritenbrink, another former ambassador to Vietnam, to be the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. This committee looks forward to working with them to continue deepening U.S. engagement and ties with Southeast Asia. And I'm confident the insights that our witnesses will share today will further shed light on opportunities for the United States to do just that. So again, I want to thank my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for his partnership and understanding of the importance of the region. And with that, let me yield 5 minutes to my friend from Ohio, the ranking member, Representative Steve Shabbat.
Thank you, Chairman Vera, for holding this hearing today. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank the panel as well for joining us today. As the former chair of this subcommittee and the co-chair of the U.S.-Philippine Friendship Caucus, along with my good friend Bobby Scott, as well as the Cambodia Caucus, I always appreciate giving Southeast Asia the time and attention that it deserves. Mr. Chairman, as those of us who have spent years engaging with the Indo-Pacific know all too well, the relationships we share with this critical region are too often overlooked in the foreign policy chatter inside the Beltway here. This is especially true today as America has woken up to the reality that we're in a period of great power competition. This reality is sharpening some paradoxical challenges to formulating an effective U.S. policy towards the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and its 10 member states. On the one hand, the United States and like-minded allies and partners are aggressively building an array of new plurilateral groups like the Quad and the AUKUS, which are essential to mitigate threats to the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, ASEAN centrality is and will remain a fundamental principle of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. A similar difficulty is that ASEAN nations seek relationships that are meaningful in their own right and justifiably resist being made into appendages or pawns of great power maneuvering. But the most important issues for us to address with our ASEAN partners are those stemming from great power competition, from trade rules to sea lanes and even the sanctity of their own sovereign territory. Likewise, ASEAN is essential to the future of the Indo-Pacific and possibly the only practical multilateral structure for nations with such disparate cultures, languages, religions, governments, and population sizes. But the troubling reality is that ASEAN often proves incapable of addressing crises. Every year, the world waits with bated breath to see whether the ASEAN leaders' statement will even mention the fact that the PRC is stealing its members' territory. And the January coup by Burma's military has once again thrown the limitations of ASEAN into sharp relief. Resolving these paradoxes will require following through on the increased engagement in the Indo-Pacific that the United States has promised over successive administrations and has so far never fully delivered on. Over the last decade, the United States has concluded that the Indo-Pacific is our prevailing foreign policy priority. But the relative foreign assistance resources dedicated to this half of the globe have barely shifted and are still far outstripped by those dedicated to the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. We also need to do better to resolve the dissonance between the perception of U.S. disinterest and the reality of our partnership. The fact is, the United States remains ASEAN's most reliable and essential external partner. In addition to our bilateral assistance, the United States is, for example, the world's largest donor to COVAX. We're also the world's largest donor to the Rohingya crisis and Southeast Asia's primary source of foreign direct investment. And far too often, American sailors and airmen are the only people standing in the way of the PRC's constant attempts territorial expansion. Going forward, it will be essential to articulate a compelling vision of what U.S. partnership offers to the nations of ASEAN. Successive U.S. administrations have struggled to offer a credible theory of economic engagement with the region, and exploring new bilateral or sectoral agreements could help. Following through on our pandemic era emergency assistance to create lasting public health cooperation could be another promising opportunity. And along with our partners, we must demonstrate that arrangements like the Quad and AUKUS will not diminish ASEAN, but elevate it and protect its members from the PRC's attempts at regional hegemony. With that in mind, I'm looking forward to discussing the Biden administration's recent high-level trips to the region and in reviewing their new version of the Indo-Pacific strategy when it comes out, which I hope will address these challenges and opportunities. The in-person engagement we've seen from the cabinet and the vice president so far this year is certainly something that our ASEAN partners will appreciate. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with our panelists, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Let me now introduce our witnesses. First, we have the Honorable David Shear, Adjunct Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He was U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam from 2011 to 2014, after which he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs from 2014 to 2016. Next, we have Ms. Meredith Miller, former Deputy Director of the Office of Economic Policy at the State Department Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Last but not least is Mr. Michael Sobolik, Fellow in Indo-Pacific Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. I thank you all for participating in today's hearing. I will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I will first invite Ambassador Shear to share his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shabbat, thanks for inviting me to appear before the subcommittee today. I'll be summarizing remarks that I've already submitted. 30 years from now, Southeast Asia will be a fulcrum of world geoeconomic and geopolitical power. Countries most engaged economically in the region will write its rules and set its standards. Countries that wield effective influence, particularly with countries bordering the South China Sea, will hold tickets to regional eminence. To be a player in the future Southeast Asia, right now, the United States will need to engage the region with a positive message that appeals directly to Southeast Asian aspirations. We'll need to conduct a vigorous regional diplomacy from the presidential level down. We'll need to devise a region-wide economic strategy, including support for infrastructure finance. We'll need to deploy our military assets in ways that better deter aggression and best fit regional strategic realities. And we'll have to increase pressure on the Burmese military regime and continue to seek improvements in democracy and human rights throughout the region. Southeast Asians want economic development, national autonomy, and a peaceful international environment. Our message should appeal to these aspirations. ASEAN leaders seek a regional balance of power that permits them maximum maneuverability. They know that they can't pursue these goals effectively without strong American regional engagement. They also know that they can't succeed if they're tied too tightly, either to the US or to China. ASEAN peoples are deeply ambivalent about the rise of Chinese influence. On one hand, their interests compel them to pursue the big economic opportunities that China offers. On the other hand, the ASEANs chafe at Chinese diplomatic high-handedness and fear Chinese economic domination. They can exploit this ambivalence, but only to a point. We can exploit this ambivalence, but only to a point. ASEAN countries don't want to be considered merely as pawns in a Sino-American struggle for regional influence. Mr. Chairman, doing diplomacy with Southeast Asia is like eating tofu with chopsticks. If you squeeze too firmly, it falls apart. If you squeeze too softly, it slips away. But we have to squeeze. If we're going to do serious diplomacy with the Southeast Asians, we need American ambassadors at post. We still don't have ambassadors in multiple Asian capitals. Every day without an ambassador at post is a day of opportunities lost to American interests. We also should engage more fully in the region at the presidential level. For the president to show up consistently in Southeast Asia is important, but even more important is the need for sustained presidential attention to the task of shifting resources necessary to make Southeast Asia a higher strategic priority. The administration came out of the gate strongly with successful visits by the Vice President, Secretary of Defense Austin, and Deputy Secretary of State Sherman. The two Quad summits hosted by the President aggressively addressed the fight against COVID, climate change, cybersecurity, technology cooperation, and people-to-people relations. This kind of effort appeals directly to regional aspirations. Members of Congress can demonstrate our interest in the region by visiting. You'll find our hosts eager to engage, and you'll find embassies eager to host you as well. We haven't had a Southeast Asian economic policy since 2016. From a strictly strategic point of view, our failure to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a blunder, and we should fix it by rejoining. We should also participate more fully in the Southeast Asian infrastructure build-out. We need to focus on infrastructure finance, local capacity building, and project preparation. Increased funding earmarked for Southeast Asia for the Development Finance Corporation, the Treasury Department's Infrastructure Transaction Assistance Network, and the Trade Development Administration would go a long way. With regard to defense, strengthening conventional deterrence in Southeast Asia is a critical task. We must increase joint force lethality, enhance our posture, and strengthen allies and partners, and we'll need to shift resources from other regions in East Asia in order to do so. The establishment of AUKUS sent the entire region a strong message of American commitment. And with regard to shifting resources, we need to look at not only our forces, but at the way in which we distribute security assistance globally. With regard to human rights, the tragic situation in Burma reflects some of the hard choices and limited options that US policymakers sometimes face in engaging Southeast Asia. We must keep up the pressure on the regime while we do all that we can to stay on the side of the Burmese people. We should appoint a new special representative and policy coordinator for Burma. The position in the State Department has been vacant since 2012. We need to expand sanctions on trade and investment with entities owned or controlled by the military regime, and we need to seriously consider declaring the military's 2017 actions in Rakhine State genocide.
Ambassador Scheer, your time's expired, unfortunately, but we look forward to expanding on your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was almost done.
Great. Let me now go ahead and recognize Ms. Miller for her testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Barrett, Ranking Member Shabbat, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective with you on this important topic, strengthening Southeast Asia-U.S. relations, particularly the economic dimension of that. The importance of that cannot be understated, and in many respects is foundational to the topic of today's hearing. This is for a number of factors that are interrelated. First, as I detailed in my written testimony, Southeast Asia is of tremendous economic importance to the United States, and there is tremendous potential for future growth. Second, as Chairman Barra and Ranking Member Shabbat noted in their opening remarks, China's economic investment influence in Southeast Asia is longstanding and is on an upward trajectory. It is in the interest of the United States to support our partners in the region in having diversified economic relationships that allow for resilience against external shocks as well as strategic autonomy. This desire in Southeast Asia for economic diversity and relationships is also driving many new negotiations of preferential trading arrangements. Cptpp is one. ASEAN is also the leader behind the new RCEP agreement, which is the largest FTA in the world, and is actively negotiating an FTA with the European Union. The U.S. is not a party to any of these new frameworks, and this disadvantages our companies over the medium and long term in particular, and also the United States as a destination for foreign direct investment. It also means that our voice at the table in developing new standards and norms in the region is weaker than it was before. It's also symbolically important. Many in the region are concerned that the U.S. has ceded leadership to China in this important economic arena. And earlier this month, China announced that it had formally applied to join Cptpp, reinforcing this narrative in certain quarters. Additionally, and perhaps really importantly for the topic of the hearing, Southeast Asians overwhelmingly want more economic engagement from the United States. Economic engagement, commercial diplomacy is at the heart of multilateralism in the region. It is the center of the mission of APEC and also core to the foundation and the activities of ASEAN. For leaders in emerging economies in the region right now, in particular, all of these issues have been thrown into even more acute relief by the devastation of COVID-19. The economic, health, and social consequences of the pandemic have put additional urgency on leaders to find new ways to stimulate economic growth and provide jobs, particularly for the very young population of the region. The Biden administration has greatly enhanced its outreach to Southeast Asia in the second half of the year, which is a very welcome development. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken has announced that the administration will soon share an Indo-Pacific strategy. We can be fully confident that Southeast Asian leaders will be looking to that strategy in particular for the economic dimension. And for it to be successful, we need to be responsive and engaged on that concern. In my written testimony, I included several recommendations for the committee's consideration on how we can boost our economic engagement in the region. Perhaps the most important and also the most challenging is for the U.S. to chart a path forward for joining Cptpp. There is no substitute for the United States in both strategic and economic importance for participating in that agreement as a way of ensuring our long-term competitive outlook and helping to provide additional development of high standards in areas like labor, climate change, and other concerns for the United States. It's also welcome to hear growing momentum for sectoral agreement negotiations, particularly in the digital policy arena. Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing internet economies in the world and a large digital market. Third, it's important to note that the United States has many strong existing frameworks for economic diplomacy in the region, but these could be usefully strengthened for enhanced impact. This includes resourcing our agencies that help to promote trade and investment, like the DFC and TDA, revitalizing our trade and investment framework agreement dialogues with ASEAN and bilaterally with key countries in the region, and pursuing Vice President Harris's welcome announcement that the U.S. would seek to host APEC in 2023. Importantly, Southeast Asia is also looking to the United States, and we can play a very important role in supporting the region in charting a path forward for equitable economic recovery from COVID-19. The devastation of the pandemic has hit vulnerable groups particularly hard, including women, the youth, and the poor. In the interest of time, I will stop my remarks here. And I very much look forward to continuing the discussion with the distinguished members of the committee.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Miller. And now let me recognize Mr. Sobelwick for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Barra. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shabbat, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is a privilege for me to appear before you today to discuss strengthening America's ties with Southeast Asian nations. The historical arc of U.S. policy in the region has given these governments ample reason to question America's reliability, commitments, and staying power. Their fears, moreover, have been made more acute in recent weeks by the precipitous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. and by a muting of the Biden administration's early clarity about the need for long-term strategic competition with the People's Republic of China. When it comes to appreciating Asian perceptions of America's role in Southeast Asia specifically, 3 case studies merit examination. The first is America's withdrawal from Vietnam in the 1970s. When the United States abruptly pulled out of Vietnam in 1975, ASEAN nations were shocked not that America had left, but the way in which it did so. America's bungled withdrawal led to hedging behavior by regional states. A year prior to the pullout, Malaysia established relations with China. After Saigon's fall, the Philippines followed suit, and Thailand reached a similar calculation shortly thereafter, normalizing relations with Beijing in a bid to have China's help to blunt Vietnam's advance into Southeast Asia. The second episode of note was Washington's response to the Asian financial crisis in 1997. That year, currency values in Thailand and Indonesia tanked and regional growth halted. Washington, however, did not lend a helping hand to Thailand, despite having given Mexico similar aid under similar conditions in 1994. China, however, pledged financing and economic support to Bangkok. It was only after the situation in Southeast Asia worsened and the risk of contagion grew that the US supported an Indonesian bailout fund. ASEAN member states, however, received the message clearly. The United States was an unpredictable partner in a crisis, perhaps even an unreliable one. The final episode revolves around America's passivity in response to the PRC's reclamation and militarization of the South China Sea in the 2010s. Beijing's fait accompli land reclamation presented serious problems to Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines, as well as Taiwan. While diplomats attempted to address the issue within ASEAN, Beijing exploited its close ties with Cambodia to scuttle any inclusion of the South China Sea in the resulting communique. Although subsequent US freedom of navigation operations communicated our resolve to sail and patrol wherever necessary, China had succeeded in creating new facts on the ground that severely complicated the economic and military calculations of key ASEAN member states. This background, in turn, casts recent events in Afghanistan in a new and concerning light, both for Washington and especially for ASEAN. To the misfortune of Southeast Asian nations, Washington is doing now what it did 40 years ago when it exited Vietnam. The US has once again haphazardly ended a war on the other side of the world and is relying on others, especially China, to pick up the pieces. This time, however, China is not an economic backwater or a military afterthought. It is the world's second largest economy, by some estimates the largest, and has the region's largest and most capable armed forces. There are, however, encouraging signs that Washington is beginning to learn from these mistakes, from the widely supported free and open Indo-Pacific concept to the commendable Mekong-US partnership that was recently established. Looking forward, policymakers would do well to give attention to 4 matters. I go into these in detail in my submitted testimony. I'll briefly touch on them now. The first is acknowledging this spotty record and committing in conversations with our partners in the region to learn from them. Secondly, is to not performatively but substantively engage in high-level officials, which my other colleagues have talked about here in the administration has done well thus far. The third is, when appropriate, to integrate our partners in ASEAN into Quad and AUKUS activities, publicly and privately. Finally, and I'll stop here given time, is to work with our partners to identify and respond to the partners inside of ASEAN that China exploits to its own benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sobolek. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we will circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Miller, you talked a bit about the importance of economic engagement, and certainly as a supporter of TPP, I do recognize the strategic blunder. That was much more a tool of both economic engagement, but also geopolitical strategy. Maybe you can comment on, I think it may be a road too far at this particular moment in time in getting back into Cptpp. But it is something that certainly I've talked to the ranking member about, and I do think there is some will in Congress in a bipartisan way and a bicameral way, especially if you look at the strong bipartisan vote on USMCA, where you actually had more Democrats in the House voting for that deal, 196 Democrats, I believe 193 Republicans. So there are opportunities to build on something. The one area where we have focused a little bit at the subcommittee level is on the digital trade arena. Certainly partners in the region, Singapore, New Zealand, others have trade deals. If you take the digital trade chapter out of USMCA, there's a strong starting point there. If you look at the Trump administration executive actions in a bilateral way with Japan, there's a starting point there. So it's not as though we have to start from scratch. Maybe you can comment on if that's the right starting point. There may be some opening with the administration. If you listen to some of the comments of of Ambassador Tai as well as the administration, there might be some opportunities there, and that's something that I think we're thinking about as a subcommittee, potentially taking a lead and sending a signal in a bipartisan way to the administration. So your thoughts on digital trade?
Thank you very much, Chairman Barra, for raising that important issue and also important opportunity for the United States. There does seem to be good momentum building for exploring a digital trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific, both among key stakeholders in the United States and also in the region. One, I think, particularly useful example to look at, in addition to building on the good provisions in the USMCA and the Japan-US agreement, is the recently concluded Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which was announced by New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile as an agreement to help establish norms to facilitate trade, but also it has a particular emphasis on digital inclusion, SMEs, and was negotiated by smaller economies. Looking through the prism of engagement with ASEAN, I think DIPA is a very useful model for the administration to consider engaging with going forward. It also has a modular approach to certain provisions, so countries can bite off pieces of the agreement at a particular time, which might make it more digestible and a stronger platform for engaging some of the less developed ASEAN economies. It's worth noting in the context of our conversation about China that China has also expressed interest quite recently in potentially joining DIPA. And it is an area where I think it's important for the U.S. to demonstrate some leadership, particularly while we navigate our path forward on Cptpp, which Chairman Barra, will be a difficult and probably long, but very important process.
Great. Maybe Ambassador Scheer, I could ask you a question. Staying on the topic of economic engagement in the region, one area we've had conversation with the Indonesians, with the Vietnamese, and others in the region is supply chain redundancy and resiliency. And we've talked to our Quad partners as well about strategically investing in the supply chain resiliency. Your thoughts on how important that would be in doing that in a strategic way?
I think it's extremely important. Supply chains have been moving to Southeast Asia, particularly places like Vietnam and Indonesia, for some time. This trend accelerated with the COVID pandemic, and I expect it to continue in the future. So Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Thailand will all become stronger exporters to the United States and more integrated members of critical supply chains. And I think engaging these countries in discussions on supply chain security not only speaks to their interest in economic development, but speaks to both our sides' interest in increased supply chain security. This is a very strong way for us, I think, to interact with the Southeast Asians, and I think it's a strong way for us to interact with our like-minded partners and allies like Japan and Australia. So I think that the stronger this item in our agenda is, the better.
Great. Thank you. And I notice I'm out of time, so let me go ahead and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sobel, I'll start with you. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I'm co-chair of the Philippine Friendship Caucus, and I'd like to know what we can do to better support the Philippines to help them push back on China's gray zone aggression. Specifically, they face constant harassment from the so-called maritime militia. What security support or means can we use to help the Philippines with this challenge?
Sir, thank you so much for that question. The crux of our response with the Philippines specifically has to be strengthening our enhanced defense cooperation agreement with Manila. This was established back in 2014. Given the recent tensions surrounding human rights, global Magnitsky sanctions that have targeted President Duterte's close associations, this agreement has been slow to come into actuality. But getting our troops and our assets rotating regularly in and out of pre-specified military bases throughout the Philippines gives us a presence beyond what we already have, a strengthened presence with the Philippines, and a cooperative one at that. And I think it not only sends an important signal to China, it is a material action. So whatever we do to reinforce our commitment, that has to be the crux of it.
Thank you. Let me go a little bit beyond the first question. I'll stick with you, Mr. Sobel, for the time being. China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea has been concerning for quite some time. They've repeatedly sought to enforce their bogus sovereignty claims against Vietnam, Malaysia, and as I mentioned, Philippines. What support, whether political, military, or otherwise, can we provide to help our partners uphold their rights against the PRC's bullying?
It starts with, to an extent, doing what we're already doing, sir. The freedom of navigation operations are good. Going beyond that, though, is important because it's clear, given recent pronouncements from China, not only that they're more fully engaging gray zone tactics with their Coast Guard, they are also trying to reinforce their claims within their own 9-dash line, which of course we reject. I think one of the most creative and admittedly difficult, but good things we could do is involve our own Coast Guard more in the South China Sea. If our goal is to deter adventurism without risking escalation, meeting capability for capability and service for service can be a good way to do this. And there's starting to be a little more research about this area coming out of integrating our Coast Guard assets more and more. And I think it's worth studying.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Scheer, let me turn to you now. I'm a believer, and I'm glad that this administration has entered into AUKUS, the new partnership. I think it's an important idea. The reaction throughout the ASEAN countries has been a bit mixed, as you know. How could this partnership and also the Quad, how is that being viewed, and what can we do to strengthen both those partnerships?
Thank you, Congressman, for that. That's an important question. Clearly, ASEAN centrality is an important theme in whatever ASEAN statesmen and stateswomen say about regional stability and security. And we need to respect ASEAN centrality. However, given ASEAN's divisiveness and lack of unity, we need to look for alternatives to bringing our influence to bear on the region. I think we need to do that bilaterally with important individual ASEAN partners, and we need to do it multilaterally. And I think the Quad and AUKUS are key tools for us to do that. As I said in my statement, the AUKUS announcement sent a strong signal to the region about our commitment. The ASEANs, I think, given their devotion to ASEAN centrality, have to react in a lukewarm fashion publicly, but I think privately they will welcome the Quad. They'll welcome the creation of AUKUS. This gives them more leverage vis-a-vis China. When the Southeast Asians know that the Americans and their allies are partners are strongly engaged in the region, this gives them the confidence they need to bring leverage to bear on the Chinese, to get what they want, and to pursue their interests in a free and open way.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but let me join with you and Ms. Miller relative to her TPP comments, and just say that when the leaders of our two parties back in 2016 both decided to oppose this, the term shooting ourselves in the foot comes to mind. And we put the PRC in a position where they're now trying to get in there and write the rules to replace the United States. And that's just, that's just a boneheaded thing for us to be in that position. And so I commend you for supporting it, as I did, Mr. Chairman. And sorry I didn't get around to you, Ms. Miller, but I agreed with your points on TPP. Thank you, and I yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's appropriate that we're having a hearing on Southeast Asia. Naturally, we have Southeast Asia experts. What tends to happen then is that people who focus their lives on Southeast Asia push for a policy that is measured by, does this help us in our relationships in Southeast Asia? When we talk about trade, we've got to balance. Is this good for our relationships in Southeast Asia? But what effect does it have on small towns in Ohio? And I know that one of our witnesses talked about how we can more effectively import from Southeast Asia. We have the largest trade deficit in the history of mammalian life on this planet. And I think it's important that we focus even more attention on how we can export to Southeast Asia. The value of the dollar is not, as a worldwide reserve currency, is certainly not helped by us having the charade we're having here about whether we'll even pay our bills, nor is it helped by the trade deficit. Likewise, with regard to aid to countries in Southeast Asia, experts in Southeast Asia say, well, help everybody, and then if somebody does something wrong, maybe we'll give them a little bit less. That gives us the most leverage. If you're giving money to Southeast Asia, the more you give, the more leverage you have, you might take it away. But every dollar that we give to the government of Myanmar, Burma, is a dollar we're not spending on the truly needy in Africa, for example. And so I'd like our witnesses to focus on the Rohingya. We were all, those of us who focus on human rights for decades, I met with Aung San Suu Kyi several times. We were all inspired by her. And now she is the apologist for a policy of ethnic cleansing, if not genocide. And actually, I think it is genocide. I have suggested in this hearing that we ought to look at the international border. If the government of Myanmar, Burma cannot defend its own people. Now that's a radical step, but there's only one change of international border that the United States has supported in this century, and that was the creation of South Sudan, and we did so as a result of acts of of genocide, probably less in terms of the numbers of casualties and displaced people than what the Rohingya have seen. So I'll ask Mr. Shear, should we be providing aid? Obviously, we should be providing aid to the refugees, but should we be providing aid that provides for the economic development of Burma, Myanmar, at a time when it refuses to provide citizenship documents and protection for the Rohingya people?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a critical question. And I'd like first to address the Rohingya issue. I think as we move forward and increase the pressure on the military regime in Burma, the Tatmadaw, I think we need to continue providing assistance to the Rohingya. We need to continue focusing on their horrific condition in camps throughout the region. There are over 700,000 Rohingyas in Bangladesh alone, in Cox's Bazar. And we need to avoid the phenomenon of donor fatigue with the Rohingyas. So I think as
the comment I would make is the fact that we're still providing tens of millions of dollars to help the government of Myanmar, Burma achieve its economic objectives is a stain on the morality of the United States. If a government is engaging in genocide and ethnic cleansing, to say, well, we're giving them less money than we used to, is an inadequate response. But go ahead.
Well, I agree that we need to limit all the resources we can that go to the military regime. I think we need to be discriminating, though. We need to, as I said in my statement, we need to keep the Burmese people on our side. We need to make sure that the measures we take to inflict pain on the military regime don't also excessively inflict pain on the Burmese people.
Every dollar that we spend helping improve the economy of Myanmar, Burma, increases the power of regime and is taken away from the poor people in other places in the world, particularly Africa. I yield back.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I guess my first question, at least, is going to go to Mr. Sobolik, and it's in regard to Duterte in the Philippines. He chose to terminate the visiting forces agreement some time ago, but has recently, as I understand it, reinstated that. And I'm just wondering if you can describe to us whether you think this kind of shift back towards the United States and away from the CCP is real, or it's just a small calculation, if it has any long-lasting endurance, or if this is completely fragile and just a momentary decision on Duterte's part to kind of advance some leverage that he might perceive that he can have regarding the CCP.
Congressman, thank you for that question. It's very important. President Duterte was highly opportunistic with his decision to hold the visiting forces agreement hostage. His threat to do so came shortly on the heels of human rights sanctions, as I mentioned earlier. And I and certainly several others interpreted his anger and his focus on the VFA as his response, not necessarily to pull the trigger on the agreement, but for domestic reasons and frankly for balancing reasons against China to build some political space for himself. And it became pretty apparent in late 2020 that he was going to punt his decision on VFA into the Biden administration. And shortly after the Biden administration taking office, he signaled his complete support once again for the VFA. And I think in some ways, Duterte's behavior, while he is certainly a unique individual, is not that unlike the calculations that many Southeast Asian countries will make from time to time, caught between two great powers as they are.
Okay, thank you. And then, just to expand on that a little bit before my next question. So, it seems like he remains opportunistic, and that he doesn't necessarily in any way, maybe it's just based on who's in the White House at the time and how he perceives things, but he is definitely can't be counted in any meaningful way in the camp of the United States or the West. Would that be a reasonable kind of overarching theme?
I would certainly say that President Duterte himself does not fit into the mold he just described, but I would also say that the defense architecture within the government of the Philippines is highly supportive of the defense cooperation they have with the United States. And putting the president aside for the moment, which I know can be a significant ask whenever addressing these things, but putting him aside for the moment, the relationship is quite strong. And there is a lot of ground to build upon. And Duterte has proven himself to be pretty shrewd and cunning. And he'll tilt towards America when it serves his interest, towards Beijing when it serves his interest. But the good news for us in the midst of that is the underlying foundation of the relationship does not appear to be fragile.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm just curious, from a regional standpoint, regarding the CCP and Taiwan. The CCP as they lose. There's obviously billions of people in China, but they're still going to suffer a loss of male workers, male people in industry and business, just based on demographics. Do you see that being a pressure point that Xi would seek to? It would force Xi into making a decision regarding Taiwan earlier, or do you think that they literally feel like they can manage that and everything else that they're seeking to accomplish, regional and international hegemony, et cetera? Do you think that they feel they can manage it, or do you think that they see that as something that's going to be very, very problematic by the end of the century?
Oh, Congressman, that is the million-dollar question, is it not? I think you're right to bring up demographics as a long leading indicator in PRC calculus. Not only unemployed males, but the gender disparity between men and women in China as well, which I recognize your time is up, but it's a very important question to be asking. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance.
Great. Let me go and recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. It's very interesting information. I'd like to ask Ms. Miller, just kind of expanding on some of the things the U.S. can do to be helpful in the region, besides just economic trade agreements. One thing that we know is that Southeast Asia is one of the world's most heavily contaminated regions with deadly unexploded ordnance. U.S. legacy cluster munitions from the Vietnam War are in Laos and Cambodia and in Vietnam, and they continue to cause civilian deaths or casualties to this day, and they make some of the productive land potentially out of use. If you travel over there, especially in Cambodia, on the streets of the city, you see these little pickup bands of people missing limbs, begging on the streets. They're all victims of these mines that haven't been eliminated. We have a demining program, and I think it serves as a positive example of our leadership and what good things that we can do to support communities. Could you comment on how things like that can better help our relations in the area as we try to combat the kind of insidious influence of China?
Congresswoman Titus, thank you for your leadership on this issue and for raising this question. I think it's an excellent example of a platform that has helped to facilitate our relationship in Cambodia, but also importantly in Vietnam, which came from a very low bar when I first started working on Vietnam relations almost 20 years ago to where we are today, where we have a close relationship across a range of issues. And part of the success of the normalization of our relationship was based on trust building exercises, such as you described, in terms of demining and finding the remains of American soldiers in the region and returning them to the United States. I think importantly, your question also signals that we need to have a strategy that allows us to engage communities and societies in these countries, not only the elites in the government, but we need the American presence and our positive contributions to the region to be understood broadly throughout civil society in Southeast Asia. And these kinds of programs are an excellent example of that. There are many others that I would commend to the committee's consideration for further enhancement, including the Young YSEALI, the Young Southeast Asia Leaders Initiative. Programs, particularly to engage young people, I think are very important for our standing and our relationships in the region going forward.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I hope we can put some support behind NDI, IRI, those kinds of programs that to come from that side of our kind of soft diplomacy. One other thing I think that we could be doing better is climate change with the new relationship, the kind of redone Global Climate Risk Index shows that some of these countries are the worst in the world for being affected by climate change. I think it's called the Mekong River Commission that's composed of Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. Is that not another way that we can better collaborate and cooperate with some of these countries on issues that affect the planet, but affect their economies as well?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I absolutely agree with that statement and know from conversations with Southeast Asian leaders and civil society and environmental groups, the threat of climate change is top of mind for countries throughout the region. There have been several studies issued, as you note, that identify Southeast Asia as one of the parts of the world that will be most critically affected due to rising sea levels and flooding, particularly in the Mekong region. U.S. participation in the Lower Mekong Initiative is a really important part of our engagement in the region, and there is room to do more, I think, on climate change. I know Secretary Kerry has dedicated much of his career to normalizing the U.S. relationship with Vietnam. He knows that part of the world very well, and I think there's a lot of scope for enhanced engagement and interest on both sides in deepening that part of our cooperation, both in terms of mitigation, but also adaptation is going to be very important to the region's economic prospects going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Miller. Mr. Chairman, maybe we can pursue that as something this committee could take up and look into further, perhaps help with. I yield back.
Very much. And we'll take that under consideration because obviously very important to the region. Let me now go and recognize the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing the hearing to examine the strategically critical relationship between the United States and Southeast Asia. As co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, I strongly believe we have a national interest in sustaining U.S. leadership in Southeast Asia, supporting human rights and respect for democratic freedoms, and articulating our strategic priorities. We will find willing partners in our many friends and allies in the region who share our grave concerns regarding the belligerence and the growing power of the People's Republic of China. Yet, the PRC, eager to undermine U.S. interests in the key region, is aggressively working to expand its influence in Southeast Asia. It seeks to exploit its predatory investment, development, and trade policies, illegal military installations in the South China Sea, and disinformation campaigns to coerce countries to accept its agenda. Nowhere are the high stakes of the competition between China and the United States clearer than in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese Communist Party is fostering resurgence in authoritarianism and oppression. It is imperative that the United States show strong and consistent leadership in Southeast Asia to secure a future in which the rule of law, free and fair trade, and democracy underpin relations among Indo-Pacific states. Beijing allows its state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, to borrow at an extremely low interest rate from public financial institutions. And as a result, these SOEs have dominated project bids in Southeast Asia, a primary target of the Belt and Road Initiative. I am deeply concerned that these policies are designed to draw Southeast Asian countries into Beijing's sphere of influence. And Ms. Miller, how should the United States work with Southeast Asian countries to prevent SOEs from boxing out more responsible, let's say, investors?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Wagner, for your question and also your leadership of the U.S.-ASEAN caucus. It's a really important conduit for engagement with the region. And you asked a really important and complicated question. Oftentimes, the United States is compared to China's activities in the region in an apples to oranges way, when in reality, our economies are fundamentally different in how we organize ourselves around our economic engagement and commercial diplomacy is very different. In the light of the tremendous amount of resources that China has allocated to the region for these projects, I think it's really important for the United States to prepare and to be an alternative, to work with our partners in the Quad, which has infrastructure as a focus area, and our partners in ASEAN to help countries improve their capacity to negotiate infrastructure deals that are transparent and adhere to international standards, and for the United States to work with our partners to provide alternative means of financing some of these infrastructure projects. For Southeast Asia, thank you
so much. My limited time here. The United States, Japan, Australia, and India are joining forces to frankly, in an unprecedented degree to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific region. I believe we should welcome this kind of revitalized Quad partnership. However, I understand why Southeast Asian countries may feel that the recent focus on the Quad leaves them vulnerable to China's influence operations. Mr. Sobolik, what role should ASEAN countries play in the United States Indo-Pacific strategy?
Representative Wagner, thank you so much for that question. I think you're right to bring up potential tensions between the Quad and ASEAN. I think one way to potentially square that is to begin behind closed doors at first to back channel upcoming Quad actions, not only with ASEAN member states bilaterally, but through ASEAN specifically, and begin to communicate very intentionally that we see no trade-off between our engagement with ASEAN and our engagements with the Quad. And I think that is going to be a very important message for ASEAN and for ASEAN member states to receive from us.
I think you're absolutely right. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman, so I'm going to yield back. I have several more questions, but I shall submit them for the record. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, for your great leadership of this subcommittee and having another important hearing. I want to try to get to COVID-19 and climate change. So starting with COVID-19, Southeast Asia continues to struggle with containing the pandemic, and particularly with the spread of the Delta variant. So let me start with you, Ambassador Scheer. Others may weigh in. Have certain countries been more successful in their approaches to COVID? And if yes, what's been the key or keys to their success? And could those steps be right, or systems be replicated elsewhere? And then beyond additional vaccine donations, what are some ways that the U.S. can support Southeast Asian countries in their fight against COVID?
Thank you, Congressman Levin, for that very important question. I think the country that is known to have done among the best in Southeast Asia in combating the pandemic is Vietnam. and they implemented some very rigorous and some might think rigid ways of containing the virus. They promoted lockdowns. They banned travel to and from the country, as many others have. They required testing to the extent that they've been able to provide test kits, and rigorous contact tracing. So the Vietnamese have been very zealous in the way in which they've limited social contact, and some might say sacrificed civil liberties in order to contain this virus. And I think what the Vietnamese experience demonstrates for us is the importance of social cohesion. All the methods they may have used might not be applicable, certainly in the United States, but certainly the high level of social cohesion in Vietnam certainly contributed to their relatively successful management of the virus. Now, they've been hit more strongly by the Delta variant. They've had an uptick of cases. I think the vice president's trip recently, her stop in Vietnam, resulted in important increase in cooperation between Vietnam and the United States. She provided another, she donated another 1 million doses of the vaccine to the Vietnamese, which brought our contribution to Vietnam, I believe, up to 5 million doses. And for the long term, more importantly, we established a CDC center in Vietnam, which will assist the Vietnamese and the region, not only in combating the pandemic, but hopefully preventing future pandemics as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me try to hit my climate change question. Maybe I'll give Ms. Miller the first shot at this. Obviously, climate change is really a huge issue for Southeast Asian nations. It's one of the regions that's most vulnerable to the harmful effects of climate change. So what can the U.S. do to support regional actors in addressing climate change challenges that threaten their economies, particularly maritime Southeast Asian nations? And, you know, I've been on this kick about, I hear so much talk about Belt and Road, and I feel like a lot of the talk about it is very anxious and defensive, where I think we should have a big-hearted, broad-shouldered American response where we don't react, but we say, wow, these countries need to change. We all do everything about how we get our power, transportation, everything, and that we ought to get in there and partner with them to create a lot of jobs by deploying mass amounts of offshore wind, solar, and so forth. So thoughts on that? I didn't leave you a lot of time, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Maybe the chairman will be a little indulgent. Go ahead.
Thank you, Congressman Levin, for your question and your interest in that issue, which is very important to Southeast Asians. I think there are a lot of things that the U.S. can do, particularly working with our private sector. As you note, there's a tremendous need in the region for infrastructure development, especially to deal with the impacts of climate change, and for technologies to help with having urbanization that doesn't rapidly increase the region's emissions profile. Southeast Asia's middle class is targeted to double between now and 2030, which will have a huge impact on consumption. And the U.S. has a lot of technology and a lot of innovations that can be deployed to help manage that challenge. And I think it's definitely an area worth further investment on both sides.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Great, thanks. And I don't see Dr. Green on camera, so let me go next to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Chairman Barra. I appreciate this hearing. Very excellent hearing, and I very much appreciate. Can you hear me okay?
I can. I'm gonna recognize Mark Green because he just.
Oh, is he back? I'm sorry. Okay. Yep.
This is you started, so let me go and recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Green, for 5 minutes.
My apologies, Mr. Chairman, and of course my apologies to my colleague from Kentucky. It's interesting. I went to West Point in 1982, only 7 years after the fall of Saigon, and a lot of the guys who taught basic training for me had fought in the Vietnam War. The United States military has this tendency to become really, really good at and study really, really well the last war we fought. And it's something we need to be better about, obviously. I think we're trying our best to be better at that. But I say that to say, when I was at the academy, I mean, we were studying Vietnam, we were studying the people, we were studying how the war was fought there, the mistakes that the United States made. And it created for me a real heart for the people. My West Point classmate actually served in the MIA commission and traveled all over Laos and Vietnam, trying to find the Americans that we were not able to bring home. Again, just have a huge heart for that part of the world. And when I was a young lieutenant, took some master's programs in developing nations with a focus on Southeast Asia. So this conference, Mr. Chairman, or this committee hearing is fantastic, and I really appreciate it. My questions are, of course, much like everybody else's, how, China and nearshoring and all the things that are impacting our relationship with Southeast Asia. My first question to Mr. Sobolik, there's no doubt that American supply chain is overly reliant on China. With regards to reshoring and nearshoring efforts, how can we reduce our reliance on China with minimal impact and disruption with what this massive shift that's been going on for some time to Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia?
Representative Green, thanks so much for asking that question. It is one of the most important ones, not just economically, but geopolitically right now. I think the reality is at some level, there is going to be some uncomfortable disruption. And I think one of the complicating factors of that is it's difficult to say for certain which countries and which interest groups are going to get the brunt of that. But I think a few things are important as we talk about reshoring and nearshoring, as you put it. The first one is going to be a consistent message to our Southeast Asian partners that, of course, fair trade matters a great deal to the American people, as successive elections have demonstrated. But the United States still does believe in free trade. And I think the reality is that our friends, allies, partners in Southeast Asia are going to be the greatest victors of free trade moving forward, or at least one of the greatest victors and reap the benefits of free trade. And it is to our strategic benefit that we nearshore a lot of the manufacturing we've relied on from China to our friends, allies, and partners there. And it goes to this fundamental tension that we've been discussing directly and indirectly during this whole hearing, which is ASEAN's economic reliance on China on the one hand, and on the other hand, their security dependence on us. And we obviously need to play both sides of that equation, not just reasserting our dependability with defense, but easing their economic dependence on China however we can.
The questions that I have, because clearly we want some nearshoring to happen. We see, China's commodity boom created a run on the currencies in Latin America. And I'm the ranking Republican on Western Hemisphere, so this is my sort of area. And in so doing, made manufacturing in Latin America much more expensive relative to Chinese manufactured goods. And so the manufacturing sector in Latin America took a massive hit. This desire for, I think, a bipartisan desire. I just made a trip with Alvio Sires to Dominican Republic, and so there's this bipartisan desire to see some manufacturing come back to Latin America. One of the big concerns is, the supply chain for parts when something is assembled. And I'd be interested in understanding a little better how particularly the Southeast Asian countries are going to feel about and what their thoughts are going to be support of being the initial sort of parts manufacturer that then get reassembled in Latin America as opposed to reassembled in China. What impact and how they're going to look at us after we try to pull that off?
Sir, that is a fantastic question. In full transparency, it's one I haven't given a whole lot of time to. So in respect to you, I would, if you're okay, sir, I'd rather take some time and circle back with your office and give you a better answer than try to give you something now.
Very much so. Appreciate it. Now you yield, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just confirming that you can hear me.
We can.
Perfect, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. My questions are going to focus largely on Vietnam, and I would also likely run out of time, so I'd like to submit the rest that I'm not able to get to for the record. I am, as many others have talked about, really concerned about supply chains and our dependency on China. Specifically, I'm going to focus on rare earth elements. For the ambassador, sir, Vietnam is one of the top 10 largest sources of rare earth elements in the world. And we really need to figure out a way to overcome China's near monopoly on rare earth elements. And Vietnam and Japan apparently have launched a joint research center in Hanoi to improve extraction and processing of these materials. I was wondering if you might know what impact the Rare Earth Research Technology Transfer Center has been having in Vietnam and Japan in terms of diversifying their supply of rare earth elements away from China. And if there are any pathways for the U.S. and the economies of Southeast Asia to reduce their reliance on Chinese rare earth elements in the supply chain. And lastly, I know I have a lot of questions, but this is just one of them. How can we as the U.S. effectively support research efforts across the region, and particularly in Vietnam, to identify substitutes or to develop approaches to reduce the amount of these elements that are required, or to recycle, reduce, and reuse them?
Ambassador Scheer, you might be on mute.
Congresswoman, thank you for that important question. It's, of course, a question that touches on the supply of all electronic parts globally, since rare earths are critical components of electronic parts. And the world has been looking for alternatives to the Chinese supply since they slapped an embargo on the export of rare earth elements to Japan, I believe, in 2010. The Vietnamese certainly are eager to help fill the demand. As you say, they have generous endowment of rare earth minerals. I think they would welcome investments in that industry, not just from Japan, but from the United States as well. When I was in Vietnam, I encouraged Vietnam-Japan cooperation across the board, including on rare earth minerals. And I think it offers us an opportunity to expand the supply, move at least portions of the supply away from China. I think we need to be doing that globally as well as just with Vietnam.
And Ms. Miller, you also spoke a little bit about Vietnam in your opening remarks. Do you have anything further to add in the area specifically of rare earth elements and reducing our dependence, and frankly, Vietnam's dependence on China in the pathways to process and develop these critical materials?
Thank you, Representative, for your question. Perhaps I'll just briefly add on to what Ambassador Scheer said, in that Vietnam, as a matter of strategic priority, is interested in decreasing its dependence on China. And I think any opportunities to work with the United States and Japan in this area would be very welcomed on the Vietnamese side.
Could I ask you to be specific on what kind of options you see for us to be able to help Vietnam move up the value chain and to diversify and to not be so dependent? My impression is that there's a lot of cross-border supply chain issues going on, origin of China, maybe processing in Vietnam, and then maybe going backwards into China for further manufacturing. Is there anything that we can be doing specifically to be more helpful to be able to advance Vietnam's kind of standing on the supply chain ladder?
Representative Houlihan, on the rare earth side, let me come back to you with a more detailed explanation, as I'm not following that issue very closely. But I think in terms of overall supply chain diversification, the relationship between Vietnam and China is very close, particularly as many industries have moved into Vietnam from southern China as their costs have risen, and in some cases to access other markets. There is an opportunity, I think, for the U.S. to continue to strengthen our trade relationship with Vietnam. It's become increasingly important for a number of our manufacturers who are seeking to diversify their own supply chains out of China. And a big piece of that is working to help improve the overall business environment and the trade relationship between our two countries.
And I thank you all, and I know I've nearly run out of time. I would like to submit the balance of my questions for the record, and I would specifically really like to find out some better information on the Rare Earth Research Technology Transfer Center and see if we might be able to suss out how effective or ineffective that is. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Let me now recognize a gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Well, thanks again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing, and to our excellent witnesses, very insightful testimony. Let me start with Mr. Sabalik about your written testimony related to Afghanistan and the impact that our withdrawal from Afghanistan has had in exacerbating this point of testimony that you have that, quote, the United States has proven itself a fickle and unsteady ally. This is concerning to me with regard to U.S. efforts to bring ASEAN countries closer to the United States and drive a wedge between us and the People's Republic of China. I think your point that geographic proximity is not the only problem here. And in the wake of the United States retreat from Afghanistan, we have seen the CCP capitalize on fears that the United States would not honor our obligations to protect our allies and partners. You cite the historical example of the withdrawal from Vietnam as another problem. But how has the Afghanistan debacle affected our credibility with partner nations in the region? And do these ASEAN countries, particularly the Philippines, who have to regularly combat incursions in the South China Sea by China, how do they still view the United States as a legitimate and trustworthy security partner in light of Afghanistan?
Representative Barr, thank you very much for that question. I'll dive into parts of my testimony in responding to you that I wasn't able to share with the full committee earlier on. The fundamental problem that the United States has with our withdrawal from Afghanistan is that we are now largely dependent on China, and to an extent Russia as well, to police the Taliban and to lean on them to crack down on terror groups operating inside of Afghanistan. And to put a really fine point on it, we are relying on other great powers who are adversarial towards us to prevent the next big terrorist attack inside of America, which then imposes significant limitations on our ability to compete effectively with the Chinese Communist Party. And we're seeing some of these dynamics come to fruition, not just because of the lost leverage we have with Afghanistan, but because of this administration's understandable desire to cooperate with the PRC on specific issues like climate change or others. The reality, though, which I believe is becoming clearer, especially in the wake of the United Nations General Assembly speeches, Xi Jinping's commitment to not fund coal manufacturing anymore, how that was a product of John Kerry's negotiations. We're starting to see some give and take and some breaking ground between Washington and Beijing. And my fear is that the cooperative agenda is starting to overtake the competitive one. Now, what this means potentially is, even though we have great defense agreements like AUKUS, we have great things like the Quad on the defense side, on the human rights side, and frankly, the counterterrorism side, we're losing leverage to the Chinese Communist Party, which makes it difficult for us in the gray zone to actually be active and proactive in defending our Southeast Asian partners day to day.
Thank you for that. And my remaining time, let me just reclaim my time and ask specifically about Singapore to any of our witnesses. As you know, we do have a strong relationship, especially in the economic relationship with Singapore. They are the wealthiest ASEAN member, accounting for 80% of U.S. ASEAN FDI, and a majority of U.S. services exports to and imports from ASEAN countries is Singapore. But it is troubling to hear the Singapore foreign minister talk about viewing China purely as an adversary to be contained will not work in the long term. What can we do? Are there specific areas that the United States can bring Singapore further into the orbit of the United States? How are we seeing Beijing attempt to undermine our relationship? What do we need to do to further integrate our economies to, again, bring them closer to us as opposed to China? Any, how about the ambassador? Could you answer that?
I'd like to take that on, Congressman, because I think it's a fundamentally important question. Our relationship with Singapore is very strong. When we pulled out of the Philippines, the Singaporeans very shrewd, very adroitly, I think, offered us facilities in Singapore to station some of our forces. We continue to have rotational forces in Singapore. Singapore also hosts a Navy logistics command. I think we need to encourage Singapore to cooperate more closely, possibly to host more rotational forces, while recognizing the limitations Singapore's instinct to balance the US and China is. I think we need to push the envelope, but we don't know how far we can go yet.
Which ASEAN country is most likely to be a candidate in the future to join the Quad?
I would, with regards to partnership with the Quad, I think we should put priority on the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia. In fact, I think we should put priority on those 4 countries in all of our approaches to ASEAN and Southeast Asia. I think that Philippines may be more likely in the long run, perhaps after President Duterte leaves, to cooperate with the Quad. I think we can elicit gradual, incremental cooperation from Vietnam and Singapore. But we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to settle for incremental steps. And we're going to have to be adept in the way in which we propose these activities to the Southeast Asians.
I'm just going to say the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the ambassador's thoughts there. Let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses, all thoughtful. Mr. Sobolik, just real quickly, you said there were 3 major events that sort of influenced the attitude toward the United States in the Southeast Asian region. The first was our withdrawal from Vietnam after that costly war. Remind us what the other 2 were?
With pleasure, Congressman. Thank you so much for asking. The other 2 were the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and our delayed response to China's reclamation and militarization of fake islands in the South China Sea.
Thank you. So I guess I would say, and I'm going to ask Ambassador Scheer and Ms. Miller to respond, but I find that list, while certainly important, to me, one of the most pivotal decisions that's affected in recent time our relations throughout this region was the, to me, catastrophic decision to renounce our own negotiated trade agreement, the TPP, which would have undergirded 40% of the world's economic trade and would have anchored these countries in a relationship with the United States. By renouncing it, we basically left them to the tender loving mercies of China, which quickly filled the vacuum. And I think that's one of the most consequential decisions of the previous president, which is going to have huge ramifications going forward. Ambassador Scheer, your reaction and your analysis of the fallout from the renouncement of our own treaty, the TPP. Ambassador Scheer, you are muted. Ambassador Scheer, we can't hear you. And you need, Ambassador Scheer, you need to speak up.
Thank you, Congressman. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I agree that withdrawal from the TPP was a mistake. As I said in my statement, I think it was a blunder. I can say that with great confidence. I think from the strategic perspective, I'm not an economist, but I know that the strategic argument had great appeal to the Southeast Asians. It had great appeal particularly to the Vietnamese. I made that the strategic argument to the Vietnamese when I was ambassador, as they were considering whether or not they would join the TPP. I think it had a decisive effect on the Vietnamese decision to join the TPP, in addition to all of the economic benefits that they would reap from the agreement. So when we pulled out of the TPP, the Vietnamese felt like they'd had the rug pulled out from under them, and they made that pretty clear to me, who had been had borne so much responsibility for getting them in the first place.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly. I agree with everything that Ambassador Scheer said. I think particularly in the case of Vietnam, a fair amount of political capital was expended domestically to come up to the standards of the TPP agreement, particularly on labor, and the U.S. withdrawal was seen as a real blow. Malaysia has also not yet ratified Cptpp. I think the withdrawal of the United States was also something that caused them to reevaluate their participation and also the commitment of the United States in the trade arena. So just very briefly, I think that's one of the obstacles that we would have to getting back in. First is getting our domestic house in order and building political will here. But second, we would have some challenges, I think, in convincing our partners in the region that we're serious if and when we decide to return to the table.
Mr. Soblik, I know you want to comment.
Congressman Connolly, thank you so much. I echo the sentiments and concerns of Ambassador Scheer and Ms. Miller. I think it was a sad message that we sent to our friends, allies, and partners who, as my colleagues have said, put a lot on the line to get an agreement of that magnitude to the level that it reached. And then to pull out when we did not send a good message at all strategically.
And do you think it's fair, Mr. Soblik, to say the Chinese have been able to exploit the vacuum we created by that renouncement?
They've certainly tried, and I think that they've had some success in trying. China has proven itself to be very adept at stepping in when we shoot ourselves in the foot, particularly in Southeast Asia, and they've certainly done it here.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Kim.
Thank you, Chairman Bera, and I'd also like to thank our ranking member Shabat, and thank you, our witnesses, for joining us today. Given the rising challenges and threats posed by competition with the People's Republic of China and our shift towards prioritizing focus on the Indo-Pacific, our relationships with the nations of Southeast Asia are crucial towards securing regional stability and economic prosperity. And to that end, I appreciate the witnesses' comments that it's strategic benefit to the United States to trade with Asian partners and strengthen security alliance and assurance to our partners, but easing their trade reliance on PRC. I couldn't agree more. The U.S. should seek to strengthen its bilateral and multilateral trade relationships with Southeast Asian nations to pave the way for future regional cooperation. Furthermore, I believe our country must revisit the Cptpp trade agreement and opportunities for the U.S. to rejoin the framework, which past administrations, both Republican and Democrats, led in negotiating. So let me pose the question to Mr. Sobolik. Would you advocate an effort for the United States to rejoin or join Cptpp? And how should we view China's request to join the agreement versus Taiwan's? And further, let me just throw it all in here. Could you please compare and contrast the benefits of a potential digital trade agreement to U.S. involvement in the Cptpp? And to what extent would such an agreement be enforceable and easier to accomplish than a more comprehensive trade agreement such as Cptpp?
Representative Kim, thank you so much for those highly important questions. First off, I'll preface with saying I'm not a practicing economist, but strategically, I think there would have been immense value to join what was then TPP. It alleviated or could have alleviated one of the greatest strategic challenges that ASEAN and its member states had. And strategically, it was quite sad that we walked away from the agreement. Again, purely on strategic merits, I think that there's a lot of justification for reviewing and reassessing that decision. Not saying that as an economist necessarily, but strategically, ample reason to revisit. On your question of Taiwan, Yet again, we're seeing Beijing box out Taipei. They've done it at the World Health Organization to great effect. They've done it at international aviation institutions. They're doing it here yet again. And this has to be one of the biggest priorities we have, to not look at Taiwan just as an East Asian problem, but to recognize the overlaps that our interests with Taiwan have in Southeast Asia too. Your question on digital, admittedly, because I'm not a practicing economist, I don't want to purport to get too deep into that, but I'm happy to do some research and circle back with you if that would be helpful.
Sure. Thanks for your perspectives. Let me next move on to our approach to human rights versus trade and security interests in Southeast Asia. Mr. Sobolik, the question to you again, how big an obstacle are current human rights conditions in Southeast Asia to broadening the U.S. economic and security engagement with the region? And how large a priority are human rights to current U.S. policy in Southeast Asia, and what are the implications of Burma's February 1st coup d'etat for broader U.S. Southeast Asian relations?
Representative Kim, not just a good question, but an important one. In Southeast Asia, we have to approach economic interests and human rights concerns both hands simultaneously. I think the administration is wrong to do that with China, which is I see as fundamentally an adversary, but with friends and partners in Southeast Asia, I think there's a lot of room to discuss and work on both of those issues at the same time, which I think is going to be necessary. Burma, we have to send a stronger message than we have, though good steps have been taken by the administration. And I know Congress is considering legislation on this effort as well. We need to make it difficult for the Tatmadaw to access their dollarized accounts anywhere with banks in the world. We have to get tougher on sanctions, and we have to do it fast.
Thank you. Oops, I'm running out of time, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Congresswoman Spanberger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate our witnesses being with us here today. And Ambassador Scheer, I'd like to focus my questions towards you at first. Recognizing that to realize so many of the opportunities that we've talked about today to build a resilience against the challenges we face, whether from foreign countries or threats like climate change, we, the United States, need a strong American diplomatic presence in Southeast Asia. And in addition to speaking local languages and really understanding local culture, it's also very important for our diplomats to have the right tools. So, Mr. Ambassador, I want to first thank you for your service in our diplomatic corps. And I would like to open the question up with, how do you think the State Department should or could or ought to update and or bolster the department's capacities and capabilities in Southeast Asia, particularly given some of the challenges that my colleagues have discussed with you all, the challenges and the opportunities that exist at this day and age?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Spanberger. And as a retired Foreign Service officer, I agree that that's a very topical and important question. First of all, as I stated it in my statement, we need to get our ambassadors out there. Yeah. Ambassadors are the people on the ground who are in the best place to identify opportunities and to cooperate with like-minded partner and allied embassies in pursuing those opportunities. I did that as ambassador with Vietnam, particularly with the Australian and Japanese embassies, well before the overall trilateral relationship among us started to develop, well before we revived the Quad. So ambassadors are critical in getting us to identify the opportunities and coordinating interagency as well. It's much easier to coordinate the interagency in an embassy than it is in Washington. So I think ambassadors can be very agile, and they need to be encouraged to do so by the State Department. Secondly,
Mr. Ambassador, if I could just interrupt you right there. So I'm a former CIA case officer, so I'm very familiar with what you mean by the interagency. Could you just give a little bit of an explanation in terms of, particularly given the challenges that exist, in Southeast Asia, the real value of having all the folks at the embassy, kind of who they are, the color and the flavor, why that matters so much to have the ambassador leading those discussions.
Because the ambassador is the representative of the personal representative of the president in that country, and the ambassador is really the best person to do what's necessary to encourage separate agencies housed in the embassy to work together, to cooperate, to do what we need to do, to come together as a country team and get done what we need to get done. And I think that we did that in getting the Vietnamese to, when I was in Vietnam, getting the Vietnamese to agree to join TPP talks. We did it in encouraging the Vietnamese to expand military to military cooperation. And we did it with the Vietnamese in conjunction with AID and our CDC office in Hanoi to increase Vietnamese capability to respond to pandemics, for example. In my case, it's H5N1. But all of these are, and to pursue commercial opportunities as well. We did that with GE, we did it with Boeing, we did it with Dow Chemical. All of those require whole of embassy efforts. And as I say, it's a lot easier to coordinate in an embassy than it is in Washington.
That's right.
It's a lot easier to take initiatives as well.
And you've served at the Department of Defense as well, and I think arguably the U.S. military has a stronger track record for really investing in training its personnel, and certainly that also Congress is involved in those decision makings as they relate to funding. But I think what would be your comments related to if the department were more consistently able to invest in the training of its foreign and civil service officers? How would that better enable stronger diplomatic engagement in regions across the world, but particularly in Southeast Asia?
The department has minimal training opportunities for mid-level and senior officers, and they need to be expanded. Mid-level foreign service officers get most of their training on the job. Fortunately, there are dedicated, strong officers in the Foreign Service who are willing to mentor younger officers. But that's significant, but it's not sufficient. The State Department needs to establish a training float. It needs to expand the number of personnel so that it can train people more effectively. And they need to do it not only in terms of language and area studies, they need to do it in terms of strategy. They need to give foreign service officers a good, strong background in American diplomatic history. We have a great tradition of diplomacy in this country, and our foreign service officers need to be more aware of it. Finally, I think we need, and this is a prominent issue, we need to strengthen diversity in the State Department. In Southeast Asia, we need to show our best face to the Southeast Asians, and that has to be a diverse face.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Scheer, and Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me run over with my time. I yield back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Congresswoman Manning, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bera and Ranking Member Chabot, for holding this very important hearing. And thank you to all our witnesses for appearing today. Clearly, Southeast Asia is critically important for the United States in light of the intense competition we are seeing with China. I want to go back to a topic that we've been discussing at great length, and that is the terrible blunder that it was for the Trump administration to walk away from the TPP. And I wonder, Ambassador Scheer, if you could talk to us about whether you think the admission to China, because we've talked about their application, would the admission of China to the Cptpp weaken the ability of the Cptpp to accomplish many of the things that we were hoping to accomplish when the Obama administration worked so hard to create the TPP? Ambassador Scheer?
Sorry, Congresswoman. You broke up on me a little, but I understand your question to be related to our rejoining of the TPP and the the awkwardness that Chinese bid for membership in that has caused us. My sense is that Chinese application for membership in the TPP has placed particularly the Japanese in a tough spot. And my guess is that given the likely lack of consensus within the TPP itself on Chinese membership, that the Japanese will delay a decision on that. That should give us a window of opportunity for trying to restore the prestige and the authority we've lost on this process, and consider rejoining the TPP.
Great, thank you. I want to ask about a different area. And Ambassador Scheer, this is for you also. I hope you can still hear me. Many countries in the region, including Indonesia and the Philippines, have faced significant challenges from the spread of religious extremism and terrorism. What level of threat to the region and to the United States does this constitute? And how is the United States cooperating with our partners to reduce extremism in Southeast Asia and any attendant risk?
Well, I think terrorism continues to represent a serious threat throughout Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. We have established strong cooperative relationships with each of these countries, both within the intelligence community and with DoD and the State Department. And I'm sure that even as our strategic priorities shift, that we will continue close cooperation on counterterrorism with these countries. I was in Kuala Lumpur from 2005 to 2008, and I have to say that the two closest elements of our relationship with Malaysia were the trade relationship and the counterterror relationship. So I'm confident that we can carry through. And of course, we've had a presence in the Philippines conducting counterterror operations in the past, and I think that has strongly enhanced our say in Manila on the need to preserve this relationship, not only in terms of counterterrorism, but across the board, particularly in defense relations.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, I want to talk a little bit about the supply chain issue. Actually, I want to talk about the companies that are moving out of China due to trade instability, sanctions, or other geopolitical concerns. How have our partners in Southeast Asia benefited from this development? And what can we in the United States do to encourage more companies and industries to move out of China to some of the other countries we've been talking about?
Thank you very much, Representative Manning, for your question. Southeast Asian countries have benefited from supply chain shifts, some countries more than others. Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and to a certain degree, Indonesia have become attractive destinations. All of these countries, to varying degrees, face challenges in building out their infrastructure to absorb some of the additional investment from U.S. companies in building human capacity and in strengthening their overall supply chain security measures to be fully integrated with the global economy. I think one of the ways that we can help with this is by re-engaging, as we've been discussing, on Cptpp and helping to build strong business environments that provide good market access for U.S. companies and strong legal and investment frameworks. And we can also work with our partners in the region to engage them in some of the important conversations the Biden administration is having about overall supply chain security in light of, in particular, some of the shocks to the system from COVID-19, as well as China's rise.
Thanks so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman? Mr.
Yes.
Chairman? Yep. Yes, Mr. Shabbat. As a ranking member of the committee, I just want to clarify for the record, the previous questioner accurately stated that President Trump pulled out of TPP, but I would note for the record that both candidate Trump and candidate Hillary Clinton both said that's what they would have done if they won. Trump won, Hillary did not. So he pulled out. She would have done the same thing according to her own statement, just to set the record straight. I yield back.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chapter. And I really do want to let me take a moment to make a closing statement. Certainly we'll give the ranking member a chance to make a closing statement. I want to thank the witnesses for emphasizing the importance of Southeast Asia, the importance of ASEAN. Some of the leading countries there, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, obviously Singapore, and we really do have some opportunities coming up with the ASEAN summits this fall. I think the administration can show leadership as they engage. And I think Congress has a real role here. I think one of the witnesses talked about the importance of members traveling to the region. One of my last trips pre-pandemic was leading a CODEL to Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. We had a chance to visit some of our special operators there. And really, many of these countries, Malaysia in particular, rarely get CODELs. And the access we got for this young, struggling democracy, it's incredibly important. So it's my hope as chair, hopefully sooner than later, to lead a CODEL to the region, to Indonesia, to Vietnam, and elsewhere in the region. Because again, I think it is important at this particular moment in time for us to emphasize that the United States sees ASEAN, sees the region as just not a pawn in a power competition, but as a real area of opportunity, growth, and engagement. So with that, again, I want to thank the witnesses for emphasizing the region, and let me give the ranking member a moment to make any closing statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. Going forward, getting our partnership with Southeast Asia right is going to be absolutely critical. Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific as a whole really are only going to grow in importance over the next generation, both in their own right. It's got over half the world's population there, as we know, and because China obviously is located there, our chief geopolitical competitor into the foreseeable future. With that in mind, I think this has been a very good hearing. I thought all three of the panelists were excellent and did a great job in answering our questions. And I think the discussion that we had shows that Congress, or at least this subcommittee, really does care about and is truly invested in our relationship with Southeast Asia. And that's important because as we seek to convince the region that America is a reliable and lasting partner, and that's particularly challenging in the wake of Afghanistan, which was I think a blunder of epic proportions, that it's substantive engagement like we've seen today that are going to really demonstrate that we mean what we say. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you to all three of our panelists who, as I said, I thought did an excellent job. I yield back.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank our witnesses and the members who participated in this very important virtual hearing. With that, the hearing is adjourned, and you have a virtual gavel banging down. So thank you, everyone. Be well. Thank you.